It is a wonderful honor to welcome Walter Block, Professor of Economics at Loyola University, and Alan Futerman, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, a PhD candidate at King's College London. Together, they co-authored the book, The Classical Liberal Case for Israel. It is both a timely text and a text that combines two of my favorite things to discuss, classical liberalism and the state of Israel. Walter, Alan, welcome to the program. How are you?
Good.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
for
me.
having us.
So, from your perspectives, American and British, how would you assess the state of classical liberalism today?
I'll go first on this one. We usually take turns, Alan and I. The status of classical liberalism. Well, one way to measure it is how many votes does the Libertarian Party get? And I'm now talking about the status of classical liberalism just in the US, where I know more about than anywhere else, and also Canada. And the usual vote total of the Libertarian Party, which is an approximation of classical liberalism, would be 1 to 3%, call it 2%. On the other hand, if you take polls of likely voters and you ask them something which approximates libertarianism or classical liberalism, namely low taxes, free enterprise, and getting rid of victimless crimes, you'll get something like 20%. So in one way, we're at 2%, and another way, we're at 20%. And that would be one way to measure the status of classical liberalism in the US and Canada.
Yeah, I could make an addition to that. If you mean by classical liberalism the advancement and thriving and flourishing of society, that is the consequence of the application of the ideas of freedom, then you could see that the world, in a sense, has never been better. And if you check, for example, human progress, there is a website that tracks human progress through a diverse set of let's say, for example, a variable, right? Like life expectancy or hours worked in order to get X amount of food or stuff like that. And you'll see that the world is getting better and better, and human flourishing is everywhere to be seen, basically, where capitalism is applied or to the extent that it is applied.
Freedom of the world. And it measures the economic freedom of the world. And it has maybe, I don't know, 150 countries. That the latest statistics there are in support of what Alan said. In spite of the wars in Russia and Ukraine, or in Israel and Hamas, the statistics indicate that there is a increase in economic freedom. So that would be another aspect of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism encompasses more than just economic freedom, but economic freedom is an important component.
Now, just an aside, Walter, what do you believe is the Libertarian Party in Canada?
I'm sorry, what do I believe is the Libertarian?
So in Canada, which party can you consider a Libertarian Party?
There's a Libertarian Party.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's a Libertarian Party of Canada.
Oh, wow.
And it runs candidates, and I think it's called the Libertarian Party of Canada. And it has officers, and it runs candidates, and it usually gets somewhere between 1% and 3%. And it's very similar in the US. The parties are similar ideologically and also in terms of the success ratio.
Yes, I studied in Canada for 4 years, and during that time, there was a new party that emerged called the People's Party. I actually had a chance to interview actually his leader, Massey Bernier. He seems to have a lot of libertarian leanings too, but he also has a immigration restrictionist point, which I'm not sure those two are compatible.
Well, libertarians are very divided on many issues. We're divided on abortion. Ron Paul is pro-life. Murray Rothbard is pro-choice. You can't get too far further apart than that. And yet you can't get two more highly credentialed libertarians than Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard, and they're opposites. And it's similar on immigration. It's similar on voluntary slavery. It's similar on reparations to Black people for slavery. It's similar on Hamas in Israel. So you can't deduce that it's non-libertarian because Maxime Bernier is certainly not open immigration, but there are a lot of libertarians who agree with him.
Right. I believe a major split in the libertarian camp is what would you consider the legacy of Lincoln to be? I believe there's the author Thomas D. Lorenzo, who has a lot of issues with the Honest Abe. So I wonder how would you two make up Abe Lincoln, our 16th president?
Well, my view, I am a fan of Thomas D. Lorenzo on this issue. He is my mentor, my guru, my advisor. I've learned more about Honest Abe from Tom D. Lorenzo than from anyone else. And he's written, I don't know, 3 or 4 books on that. And I don't know how many articles, must be dozens of articles. And I think that he is dead on and exactly correct. And I'm a fan of his. I'm not a fan of his so much on Israel because he's the president of the Mises Institute, and I used to be a senior fellow there, and he booted me out of it because he and I disagree on the Israel-Hamas issue.
I must say that I don't agree with Di Lorenzo. No, not about the first subject, nor on the second as well.
And do you, I believe you've already answered this, but do you see classical liberalism as libertarian or conservative in the contemporary political scene?
You want to go first on this, Alan, or should
Okay.
I?
Well, I mean, it depends because it's a continuum, you see, and it is, you have degrees of freedom in the philosophy, and basically you have let's say the anarcho-capitalist perspective, which is, let's say, it takes freedom to its last consequences, right, in the political sphere. And then you have classical liberalism, you have minarchism, you have US constitutionalism. I mean, you have many different applications of the philosophy to certain different extents in the political arena. So what I'd say is that it depends. I would try to frame the question differently, and I think the answer is what Walter mentioned first, that there are enormous differences among libertarians on specific issues, and so therefore you could find you could find specific politicians, for instance, because I think you are pointing the question to the political sphere, and you have politicians that have ideas more compatible with libertarianism, and at the same time they have ideas that are compatible with conservatism. And you can see, for example, that is not much different than the overlapping in certain issues, like, for example, economics, among libertarians and conservatives. In that sense, you could see, for example, that, let's say, the Cato Institute can find common ground in some aspects of economic freedom with, I don't know, the Heritage Foundation, for example. I don't know, Walter, what you think.
No, I agree. I agree with you. The way I see it, the essence of libertarianism is really 3 principles. The non-aggression principle. You're allowed to do anything you want, just don't invade or aggress against anyone else. The private property rights based on homesteading, which means that we favor private property rights, and then free association. No one should be compelled to associate with anyone else. And the group that most strongly adheres to this would be anarcho-capitalists, because government taxes people and people haven't agreed to pay taxes. And anytime you're compelled to pay and you haven't agreed to pay, that's theft, and the government is per se theft. But only the anarcho-capitalists, who comprise maybe 1% of libertarians, would agree with that. One step below that would be the minarchists, who the most famous minarchists would be Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick, and they would say, well, government has a legitimate function, and that's to protect the people in the country. And to that end, you have armies to make sure foreigners don't invade, police to make sure locals don't invade, and courts to determine who's who. And right below that would be U.S. constitutionalism. The most famous person there would be Ron Paul, and he would add highways and post offices, and also he would determine a Supreme Court which would determine issues the way he would, not the way the present Supreme Court would. And lower than that would be classical liberalism, and the most famous people there are Hayek and Milton Friedman, and they would add even a few more functions. And I would say each of the other three have about 33%, and the anarcho-capitalists, most famous one would be Murray Rothbard, have 1%. And in terms of, are we closer to the right wing or to the left wing, I would say we're right in the middle. And whenever they give me a survey of where are you on the political spectrum, I end up right in the middle, because on all the economic issues, I vote for free enterprise with the conservatives. And on all the personal liberties issues, like victimless crimes, like drugs and sex and other things like that, I'm along in congruent with the left. So I end up right in the middle, which just shows that there's something wrong with the way the political spectrum is orchestrated, because I'm not really a moderate. I'm an extremist on both senses. So there are many libertarians who say we're more of the right. Hans Hoppe says that. I disagree. I think we're equidistant from the left and the right, and we agree with the right or conservatives more on economic issues, and with the left more on personal liberty issues.
Now, within the realm of, I suppose, libertarianism, two of the thinkers that have been the most informative to me, at least, are F.A. Hayek. I visited his grave in Vienna. Just such a remarkable man. And of course, Bob Nozick, whom we mentioned. Anarchy, State and Utopia. I believe that's his most famous work. That's a wonderful work of philosophy. Now, Hayek, in his epigraph to The Road to Serfdom, he says, dedicated to the socialists of all parties. And I think that's remarkable, because as it stands right now, the principles of classical liberalism is not entirely adhered to by either the Republicans or Democrats in the USA, and of course, in the United Kingdom, the Conservatives and the Labour Party. So tell me about how can classical liberalism function, or I suppose encounter a revival within this duopoly?
Well, I want to tell you two Hayek stories. One is I beat him in chess. I once played him chess and I beat him. It's true that the way I beat people in chess is I say, look over there, and I grab the guy's queen, and then I win. I'm kidding. I actually did beat him in chess without grabbing his queen. The other thing I wanted to do is read you his foreword to my book, Defending the Undefendable, which when I got it, I thought he was really drunk when he wrote it. I still don't believe he wrote it, but I have a letter from him with his signature on it. It says, looking through Defending the Undefendable made me feel that I once more experienced to the shock therapy by which more than 50 years ago, the late Ludwig von Mises converted me to a consistent free market position. Even now, I am occasionally at first incredulous and feel that this is going too far, but usually find that in the end that you were right. Some may find it too strong a medicine, but it will still do them good even though they hate it. A real understanding of economics demands that one disabuses oneself of many dear prejudices and illusions. Popular fallacies in economics frequently express themselves in unfounded prejudices against other occupations. And in showing the falsity of these stereotypes, you're doing a real service, although you will not make yourself more popular with the majority. That's this book of mine, Defending the Undefendable. On the other hand, a third story, he did write this book, A Road to Serfdom, I think, which is his most famous book. And in there, he sort of gave away the store. And I wrote a very critical review of that book. And I felt sort of surly because on the one hand, look how nice he was to me. And now I'm being nasty to him. But I think that he welcomes criticism, honest criticism. I didn't call him bad names or anything, but we disagreed. And so I have a great interest in Hayek, and I think on net balance, he was certainly a force for the good. And one of his essays was Why I Am Not a Conservative. So he is a libertarian. He's a classical liberal. He's not a conservative.
Getting back to your question, you asked how could there be a revival of classical liberalism, right?
Yes.
Well, in a sense, you can see that the ideas of classical liberalism influence the political discourse. I mean, you have, for example, let's say extreme examples of that, like libertarianism as such, with Javier Milei in Argentina, for instance. But then you see specific policies everywhere that are part of the mainstream of political thought, if you will, which are basically ideas of classical liberalism: division of power, change in government every XYZ years, constitutions to limit power, checks and balances. I mean, those ideas which we regard today as common or not specifically tied to a particular political philosophy, but as common sense, are actually part of classical liberalism. Now, you could say, what happens with that part which is more intervened in human affairs, which is economics? Well, in that same respect, you could see that it goes back and forth. It's a pendulum. Sometimes you go more to the left in economic interventionism, and then you go back more to the right, if you will. But as Walter said, the way we frame these things on the political spectrum is wrong. Basically, it's anti-state or anti-intervention and more individual freedom as the opposite: statism and interventionism in the individual's affairs. So I think it's a continuum. Now, if you mean a specific political party that aligns with the classical liberalism or libertarianism, then Walter just replied in his first answer to that question.
Yeah, the Libertarian Party. And I would also say what we're now doing is part of the revival or the promotion of classical liberalism. This interview, which discusses these issues and will go out to many people, would be one small instance of that revival.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I try to adhere to classical liberalism as much as I can, against the ties of left-wing and right-wing dogmatism and etc. And another topic which I have to avoid steering into the realm of dogmatism is, of course, discussions on the state of Israel. And I do understand that, as you've alluded to earlier, Walter, American libertarians seems to have a split in regards to what to deal with the state of Israel. I was actually introduced to you by Hans Hermann Hoppe. He wrote a pretty scathing critique of your views on Israel, and I believe the split between I guess you and Hoppe is that is your interpretation of the non-aggression principle. So I suppose by helping us understand what you mean by it, you can perhaps enlighten us as to what the debate is.
Alan, why don't you go first on this? I've gone first on more than my fair share.
Oh, well, Hoppe's open letter against Walter basically states that Israel is the aggressor And
let me interrupt, Alan. You're wrong.
yeah,
It wasn't a letter against me. It was a letter against both of us.
yeah, mainly, but yeah, that is true. Now, basically, what Hoppe regards as the cause of war is the state of Israel. Now we have the opposite position, and we replied to that letter with an essay tackling all the issues that he raised, and basically that is it. Now I think that the more fundamental split, if you will, within the libertarian movement regarding this particular subject deals not with war itself, but with the cause of war, or to put it differently, with aggression and the use of force. Some libertarians consider that any instance of the use of force, even in self-defense, is to a certain extent an instance of aggression. And so when the state of Israel defends itself, they say like, well, you can defend yourself, but not like this, for instance, right? But that is how the subject is, or the approach is framed. But it isn't like that. In reality, this type of libertarians and anti-Zionist libertarians actually oppose the state of Israel and see the state of Israel as the primary aggressor. Although they could say, for example, that Hamas committed atrocities on October the 7th last year, but in reality, they think Israel is the aggressor, and it's based on expropriation and ethnic cleansing and every myth that is out there against the state of Israel. So I think that is the fundamental split that exploded after October 7th, because before that, there were libertarian anti-Zionists, but as in general, you know, it's the libertarian movement is not different from the rest of the political debate and discussion in the Western world, right? I mean, you could see the same thing going on in university campuses all around America and in Europe, and you have an explosion in anti-Zionist hatred and anti-Semitism as well. So it's like it was obvious that the libertarian movement is not going to be isolated from that fact.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with what Alan said. The Hans Hoppe took great issue with our stance on Israel. It's interesting that he never read our book. And again, I'm going to flash our book here. He didn't read this book. We could tell by what he said. Instead, what he did is he replied to an essay that Ellen and I co-authored on the Wall Street Journal. And this isn't really kosher. I mean, if you're going to criticize people, and they've written an entire book and also a small article on the Wall Street Journal, which is, I don't know, 700 words, you don't just confine yourself to the 700-word op-ed. You read the book. I mean, when I criticize Hans, and I do, I read his entire book if it's relevant. And he deprecated the seriousness of October 7th. He said maybe, I think it was only one child was killed, and it was due to friendly fire.
He said that friendly fire by the IDF caused the casualties, which is ridiculous.
It's just, and even if that's true, well, as Alan mentioned to me very forcefully, well, why did we have friendly fire in the first place? I mean, it's real. The IDF doesn't just go around shooting Israeli citizens. The reason we had friendly fire or crossfire is because of what Hamas did. And you see, what Hans would say is, okay, they shouldn't have done what they did on October 7th. And not only Hans, but every other critic of Israel. And they'll say, but almost 40,000 civilians have now been killed in Gaza. And this is ethnic cleansing and genocide and this and that and the other. And I would say that Israel has done more than any other military to protect the civilians of the opposing group. They send out leaflets. Hamas doesn't send out any leaflets. They say, well, Israel is, Tom DiLorenzo says that Israel is purposely targeting civilians. This is utter nonsense. They're trying not to impact civilians, but there's always going to be collateral damage in any modern war. And what Hamas does is it embeds itself in the civilian population. It puts rocket launchers in the middle of a hospital. It puts rocket launchers in the middle of a school or in the middle of a residential area. And now it's saying, well, Israel can't defend itself because if they do, they will necessarily kill innocent people, but they're responsible for the death of these civilians. Now, first of all, I'm not sure about that number of 40,000 or 38,000. That comes from Hamas, and we have to take that with not a grain of salt, but a bucket full of salt. But let's stipulate that it's true. Just arguendo. Whose fault is it? Is it Israel's fault for defending itself by trying to end Hamas, which in its covenant says that their goal is to kill not just Israelis, but all Jews? No. I think Israel is in the right, and Hans Hoppe and Tom DiLorenzo and other libertarians who oppose Israel defending itself are in the wrong.
Yeah, just let me add some things to this. I mean, the point is that I try to say here is that it's important to consider the type of anti-Zionist mentality that's behind these type of arguments, which is basically that the source of all evil is Israel. And therefore, if anything wrong happens, it cannot be Israel's enemies because they are fighting absolute evil. So it must be Israel, which is why they love to say, for example, that October 7th, it was, let's say, a false flag, or it was, created in order to attack Palestinian Arabs later, or that the IDF killed the Israeli civilians. So it's always structured in a way as to find Israel as the ultimate, party to blame in the situation. That's part of the anti-Zionist mentality, which cannot find anything good in Israel, but everything evil, and cannot find or see anything evil in Israel's enemies because they are Israel's enemies. And in this respect, for example, when they say, look, what Israel is doing in Gaza with respect to ethnic cleansing, let's say, and they say they made people in northern Gaza to move south because they are ethnically cleansing them. But at the same time, they don't recognize that Israel is trying to reduce civilian casualties. And that specific movement of people, which is temporary, because that's why they dropped leaflets and they gave like millions of texts and calls in order to ask people to leave, because Hamas is embedded within the civilian population, and it has created a network of tunnels below cities that has the size of the London Underground. And that is why Israel has to engage in that type of warfare in those areas, because Hamas has turned civilian areas in military zones by establishing their rocket launchers there, their weapons deposits, by attacking from those places. So that's the situation. But at the same time, if you don't drop the leaflets or make the calls or send the texts, civilian casualties will increase. And the anti-Zionists will say, well, they are doing this on purpose. But if you do drop the leaflets and make the calls and whatever, and you tell people to leave temporarily, you say that Israel is doing ethnic cleansing. So you see what I'm getting with this. There is no way that you will not find any action of Israel as in the wrong if you begin with the premise that Israel is the aggressor, which is what anti-Zionists do. And in this same respect, they use this figure 30,000, 40,000 let's say the casualties are between 25 and 30,000, right? Of which about 15,000 are Hamas operatives, because also that's another thing. They say everyone that's dead is a civilian. How could that be? Hamas is launching thousands of rockets to Israeli civilians, and it's fighting, and it invaded Israeli territory on October the 7th. So how can you say that there is no single Hamas terrorist that has been killed? It's ridiculous. So, but at the same time, let me give you another point, which is the following. The state of Israel has a very powerful army, the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, and it's been waging this war, this self-defensive war, since October the 7th last year. It's I mean, a lot of months, okay? Hamas killed in one day 1,200 people, give or take, right? If the state of Israel would be pursuing genocide, as Hamas did on October the 7th, in one day, killing 1,200 people, if the IDF would be following the rate of killing of Hamas that has genocidal intent, there would not be 30,000 people dead. There would be more than 200,000 people dead. And in fact, Israel could have ended this war if it would be looking to commit genocide or ethnic cleansing. In one day, it would simply level the entire area. But it was not the goal. The goal is to destroy Hamas. And basically, that's everything that we can say about that, unfortunately, which means that Israel is fighting a self-defensive war. It's a very difficult situation because the enemy uses its own civilians as shields and wants to maximize Israeli casualties and Palestinian Arab casualties. So it's a very complex situation. And unfortunately, it's severely distorted, particularly by this type of anti-Zionist libertarians that support this type of non-libertarian regimes. Let us put it in that way.
Let me just add a slight addition to what Alan said. Alan and I have co-authored not only this book, but many op-eds in addition to the Wall Street Journal. One of the places that we publish regularly is Israel Hayom, Hayom. And our most recent publication there is called Israel Derangement Syndrome. And this is our explanation as to why there's such mishigas craziness out there. People just are deranged on Israel. They're not thinking clearly. They don't realize that Israel is in a defense. The National Basketball Association just finished their tournament, and the Boston Celtics won. And whenever you go to a basketball game, everyone in the audience knows the difference between offense and defense. When the other team has the ball, you yell defense. But somehow these commentators can't tell the difference between offense and defense. They think Israel is being offensive. No, Israel is on the defense.
When it comes to discussing anything related to Israel, not just the war, the current one, or any previous war that Israel has been involved in since its establishment, you have to consider that you are swimming in a sea of falsehood, mostly coming from the anti-Zionist side, and you have to consider that, of course. And what you have to also consider is that much of these falsehoods come from the very firmly held conviction that the state of Israel is not a legitimate entity. Is called by many names, of course, settler colonialist, or again, genocidal or ethnic cleansing. These are all the words that they use, the anti-Zionists, to delegitimize the state of Israel. Now, of course, I've always believed that Israel is a legitimate state, but I'd like to ask, how would you justify its legitimacy, or the legitimacy of any nation state, using classical liberal principles? Because, well, I should like to add also, because many states are including, I suppose, the United States, are established through conquest. For example, I'm not saying Israel is not is part of that, but many states that are considered legitimate are established as a result of conquest by one group against the other. So how would a classical liberal establish the legitimacy of that case?
Can I begin with this one, Walter?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure.
Well, you from the anarcho-capitalist perspective, of course, no state is legitimate because every state entails in some form of an or another the violation of the non-aggression principle, right? Now, for classical liberalism, that's a philosophy that considers that there are certain functions that the state, as a monopoly of force on a specific area, that there is no alternative to it, and those functions need to be performed by that state. What's the premise? Well, the premise on the classical liberal tradition is that is for the benefit of the individual citizens. So in that respect, you could say, if there is a state on the classical liberal tradition, it needs to be a state that respects, to a certain extent, individual rights. Okay, so in this respect, what kind of individual rights? Well, right to property, to free association, freedom of expression, etc. So in that sense, you could say, well, what states are legitimate according to classical liberalism? Those that respect those individual rights. Okay, and so in this respect, there are two issues to be considered in the case of Israel. One is the origin of the state of Israel, and the other is the type of state that it is. Now, on the first part, you could see that basically when the state of Israel was born, it was born as a result of there was a war, right? But there was a community there, the Jewish community, that purchased land, developed land, and it had a deep connection with the land for thousands of years, basically, since the Jews were expelled roughly between 2000 and 1400 years ago, okay? But there has always been Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and 150 years ago, Jews began to go back there, and they purchased land. And so the first charge against Israel, I mean the origin of Israel, is the expropriation, massive expropriation, etc. Well, the territory where the state of Israel was founded in 1948 had the following figures, roughly, of ownership, land ownership in that area. About 9% was owned by Jews, and about 16% was abandoned by Arabs during the ongoing fighting, and a bit more than 3%, 3.3%, was in the hands of Israeli Arabs. The rest of the land, that's 70% of the land, was owned by the government. First the Ottomans, then the British, and then it passed to the state of Israel. So it was owned by neither of both communities. At the same time, a part of that which was regarded as owned by Arabs was land that was regarded as uncultivated. We know that it was not homesteaded, because you cannot regard uncultivated land as homesteaded, because, I mean, where is the homesteading to be seen, right? And at the same time, we could add to this other subjects that we talk about them in the book, and about the development by Zionists, and the investments that they did for the land, and the draining of swamps. I mean, so basically, the land where the state of Israel was established, it was not stolen, it was not expropriated from Arabs. So that's point number one. Point number two, ethnic cleansing. The idea that the Jews or the Zionists deliberately expelled about 600,000, 800,000, 900,000 Arabs from the land where the state of Israel was established. That's a lie as well. Most of them fled out of fear of war, and some of them, in effect, were displaced during the ongoing fighting. But that fighting was the result of a war that the Arab states launched against Israel. So That's what happened. But more important than that, there were about 150,000 Arabs that remained in Israel and are basically the basis of today's 20% Arab population in Israel, which are equal citizens with full rights with respect to the Jews. They are all citizens of the state of Israel, and so that's part number two of the legitimacy of a state. It's a state where citizens have the same rights, where Arabs are politicians, members of the Supreme Court, where they have their professions, where they can go to universities. I mean, there's no difference. So you could see clearly that there is no way to say that the state of Israel is illegitimate from a classical liberal perspective. Quite the opposite. The state of Israel is the only state in the area in the Middle East that has a vibrant democracy, in the sense that it has this political system that respects individual rights to the same extent that other Western nations do. And at the same time, it thrives economically. It's an example of entrepreneurial capitalism. And I mean, there are many things that one could say about the state of Israel, but basically those two are, intertwined with the origin of Israel, its development, the fact that it had to fight several wars in self-defense. And the most important thing is that in Israel, anyone can say whatever it wants, basically, because it's a free country. And you even have political parties that want to destroy Israel, that are part of the Knesset. That is, for example, one Islamist party with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood was part of the previous coalition in Israel, part of the government, I mean. So this idea that the state of Israel is like a dictatorship or a theocratic totalitarian state or whatever is ridiculous, and it's not based on fact. Walter, would you like to add?
Yeah, I like Alan's division into part one and part two. Part one is the inception and the property rights, and part two is how do they treat people. I would add to the part two, gay pride parades are allowed in Israel. And my favorite opponent of Israel is Queers for Palestine. There is such a group. I'm not making this up, but there is a group called Queers for Palestine. And if they were to go to Gaza and have a little march, they'd be killed. Whereas in Israel, they could join the gay pride group or their parade. And Israel is sort of like the United States or Canada or Western democracies in terms of how do they treat homosexuals. Why do I pick on homosexuals? Because that is a group that is denigrated, and their rights are violated, certainly all throughout the Arab world. So in terms of how do you treat the people, Israel is doing, I don't know, A-, B+. They're not perfect. No country is perfect. They're human beings. The human beings are imperfect, but you have to give them pretty good grades. Now you talk about apartheid. South Africa is, I don't know, apartheid central, not now, but previously. And they launched an ICC thing against Israel. As there 20% of the citizens are Arabs or Druze, and they are part of the military. They're part of the Supreme Court. They're not only students at universities but professors at the universities. They're treated roughly like anyone else. So this argument is nonsense. What about part one? Again, I agree with Alan. No shock. I mean, we're co-authors on this issue. We certainly agree on virtually everything with regard to Israel. The inception of Israel was peaceable, except that 7 Arab countries launched a war against this new country. So Israel was on the defense from day one in 1948. I think it was April, but I'm not sure of the exact date when all this started, but it was in 1948. And now they want to have the right of return. They want to have, I don't know, several million people who are sworn to kill Jews to come back to Israel. At around the same time, 1948, at around the same time, there were roughly the same number of Jews that were kicked out of Arab countries, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, whatever. And they were integrated into Israel, whereas the Arabs who left were not kicked out, were left voluntarily. Some of them were afraid of war. Some of them were cooperating with the invading armies, which said, look, Arabs, please leave this area because we want to kill all the Jews, and it'll be easier for us to kill all the Jews if you're not there because you'll just get in the way. The war will take a week or two, and then you'll come back. Well, the war went the other way. One would think, but nobody mentions these Jews. They only mention the right of return of the Arabs should come back to Israel in mass, but they never mention the land that was stolen from the Jews in Egypt and the other Arab countries. So this is sort of a biased way of looking at the issue.
Yeah, just to add one thing, I mean, ethnic cleansing and expropriation, it happened with the Jews of Arab countries. Whereas in Israel, you have 20% Arab population, in the Arab world, you have almost no Jews. And those that lived there were expropriated and ethnically cleansed. We're talking about 1 million of them, like Walter said. This subject is never mentioned. No one cares. No one cares. And it's also part of the same, cause of conflict. It explains why there is a rejection of the state of Israel, because it's a Jewish state. And the rejection of the state of Israel is born out of the idea that there should be no Jews in the land. They sometimes anti-Zionists say, no, before the state of Israel, Jews lived side by side with Arabs, and that's a lie. There were pogroms before the establishment of the state of Israel, for example, in 1929 in Hebron, and even before. And so basically, the entire problem is the rejection of any Jewish presence in the area, whether or not in the form of a state.
Yes, I read in Tablet magazine that the population of Jewish people in Yemen, for example, is 5, not 500, not 5,000, 5. So the three of us are the equivalent of 3/5 of the Yemeni Jews of today.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this would be the case or not, because I didn't do the research, but I read a few days ago that the last Jew in Yemen died.
Mm.
So yeah, you said 5. Well, it was 1, and he's no longer among the living. And so there are no more Yemeni Jews. And we're talking about the community that had thousands of years of history in the area. And so it's a good example.
Yes. But let's talk about the phrase Israel has a right to defend itself. I think there's a lot of confusion surrounding this phrase. Those who I think say it and mean it, I'd say something like the Biden administration being an example, has a very limited range of actions that Israel can do to, well, defend itself. Of course, that does not include IDF troops entering Gaza to rescue hostages and assassinate military targets, which are obviously legitimate in a war scenario. I suppose something that would be preferable to President Biden and his administration would be some more funding to reinforce the Iron Dome so that an invasion like what happened in October the 7th never happen again, or the Israelis and the Americans would pick up the phone and negotiate with Hamas to release the hostages in exchange for, I suppose, a number of prisoners being held in Israeli prisons in those scenarios. Would you say that scenario is a little bit too on the naive side?
Well, I'm not a real big fan of Biden in terms of Israel. He's, I would say, a fair weather friend of Israel. And I think one of my articles even mentioned backstabbing in the sense of withholding military armaments that were promised to Israel. And I think you're quite right that Biden does think that Israel should defend itself, but with 1 3/4 hand behind its back. It shouldn't defend itself as the U.S. would defend itself if, I don't know, if Canada attacked the U.S., Biden would defend the U.S. With no hands behind his back. But he wants Israel to defend themselves with 1 3/4 hands behind his back. They shouldn't do this. They shouldn't do that. They should feed the enemy. They should be nice to the enemy. He wouldn't treat an enemy like he wants Israel to treat its enemy. So I am not a real big fan or supporter of Biden. Yes, he is somewhat of a supporter. Now, a lot of critics, libertarian critics say, well, the U.S. shouldn't be giving any foreign aid to Israel. And I agree, they shouldn't. The U.S. should not be giving any foreign aid to Israel. But on the other hand, and by the way, Israel is the single country that gets the most foreign aid. And I shouldn't even mention the word foreign aid because of Peter Bauer, but I'll mention it with apologies to Peter Bauer. Yes, Israel gets more foreign aid than any other one country. However, if you add up all the foreign aid given to all of Israel's enemies, it's way more. So if the U.S. stopped giving foreign aid to anyone, Israel would lose because it has less money with which to defend itself, but its enemies would have much, much less money. So Israel would be in a better position. And also, a lot of times Israel is so dependent upon this largesse from the U.S. that it doesn't act as it would if it weren't so dependent. My favorite example of this is the Sinai Peninsula. In the 56 war, at the end of it, Israel was occupying the Sinai. And look, when country A attacks country B in an unwarranted way, and at the end of the war, country B has some of country A's territory, it should keep it. I mean, that's how Israel got the Golan Heights, because there was a war started by Israel's enemies. And at the end of the war, the Golan Heights was in Israel's hands. And the Golan Heights, a little mountain in the north of Israel, where they used to throw rockets or launch rockets down on Israel. And I think Israel has every right to keep the Golan Heights, and also Gaza and Judea and Samaria. But the Sinai Peninsula, they also had a right to keep it because this was a defensive war against Israel. Only Eisenhower, I think he later said that this was his biggest mistake of his administration, but I'm not sure about that. But he told the Israelis to leave Sinai, and they did. And I wish they hadn't. Israel would now be, I don't know, 10 times bigger than it now is, and would have more of a buffer. But the general point is that this foreign aid makes Israel dependent upon the U.S., and the U.S. doesn't always have the best interests of Israel at heart. Many times it does, but not always. And I think Israel would be better off if the U.S. stopped foreign aid. Not if it only stopped foreign aid for Israel and kept foreign aid for every other country. I wouldn't advocate that. But I would certainly advocate as a libertarian, as an American, that the U.S. not have any foreign aid to any country.
Anything to add, Alan?
No, just that, I mean, for example, the when Israel gave the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, it was done so in the context of a peace deal. And so you could say, well, as part of diplomacy between those countries, you could get to those agreements if they are mutually beneficial, but not as a result of the pressure of another country, because that won't be beneficial in the end. And yeah, basically that is what I wanted to add.
Right. So I would like to
just one more thing. I was told once by a professor and a friend of mine, Gustavo Peretnik. He told me that I think there is much truth in this quote. He said the following. He said that I don't know if it was his, but I've heard it from him. It says that the Arab-Israeli conflict will be solved once the world stops trying to solve it. And I think there is super deep wisdom in that quote.
While we're talking about quotes, I want to mention two more quotes, one from Golda Meir, one from Bibi Netanyahu. The quote from, and these are paraphrased, they said it more brilliantly than I can, but I've got the gist of it. Golda Meir said that the war will end between the Arabs and the Israelis when the Arabs start loving their children more than they hate Israelis. Right now, they hate Jews more than they love their own children, and that's why we have problems. The second quote is from Benjamin Netanyahu, who said, if the Israelis put down their arms, there would be a slaughter. All the Jews would die. If the Arabs put down their arms, there would be peace. Two brilliant quotes to add to Perednik's quote. I think these are three very important quotes for to be publicized.
Yes, and of course, that quotation was from Prime Minister Meir's autobiography, and I believe the quote that directly precedes the one that you've cited is that she says that we can forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but we can never forgive them for making us kill theirs. And
Right.
It's just so powerful.
Beautiful, beautiful quote. I think that was Golda Meir, but I'm not sure.
Yep, yep.
That was her, yes. It was in her autobiography.
Yep.
Beautiful.
So I wish to end on these 2 points. Many anti-Zionists wish to sever the connection or question the connection between Judaism and Zionism. And an example is actually someone that I went to university classes with. She says that, well, you can practice Judaism anywhere in the world, and there are synagogues all around the world, not just in Israel. But Zionism is it's directly tied to the land of Israel, and it presupposes the presence of Jews, and I guess according to her, only Jews in the land of Israel. So tell me about the case against this I guess questioning of this connection.
It's very easy to show that it's a bit absurd, because Judaism comes from Judea, basically. And what this means is that the connection between the Jewish tradition, Judaism, and Jews, the Jewish people, with Judea, or the land of Israel, is so deep, and it has been integral part of the tradition of the Jewish people for thousands of years, to such an extent that every time a Jew prays, it points to Jerusalem. Continually, every Jewish text mentions the land of Israel and Jerusalem. And conversely, in Israel, you have most of the Jewish people living in one single country. You have the country where the Jewish language, Hebrew, is spoken, that follows the Jewish calendar, where the Jewish books are studied, that develops every kind of Jewish, cultural creation. And you could go on and on and on. But basically, the idea is that it is true that you could be a Jew outside of Israel, but that won't make you forget the land of Israel. The land of Israel is an integral part of the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. And so this idea that Zionism is a part of Judaism. It is an integral part, basically. I mean, you could say even that Zionism first appeared during the expulsion of Jews by the Babylonians 2,500 years ago. So basically, I mean, you could say that there is this work by Verdi, the Nabucco, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and that's basically a Zionist work by Verdi. And what I mean with this is that there is no way and also no necessity to disconnect Zionism from Judaism, apart from the fact that more than 90% of Jews all around the world are Zionists. What does it mean to be Zionist? It means that you support the establishment of a Jewish national home in the ancestral land of the Jews. Does that mean that you defend it on theological grounds, or that you support, for example, the establishment of a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River, or between the Nile and the Euphrates rivers? No, it doesn't mean that. It simply means that the Jews have a right to go back to their ancestral land and to work the land and to build their own national home in the form of a state, in this case. But that's what Zionism means. It doesn't mean anything more than that, which, by the way, is what Israel is. Israel is a very small country that it's mainly focused in, allowing the conditions for Jews to thrive as individuals in a country where they don't get to be persecuted or discriminated, or legally discriminated because they are Jews. That's the entire idea.
I would say that Israel is Jews' insurance policy. We Jews have been kicked out of many, many different countries. Right now, being a Jew in Canada or in the United States is pretty comfortable. Yes, there's Harvard and Columbia University, where the Palestinian supporters are adamant that Jews are evil. And many college campuses have this. And yes, there's been anti-Semitic activity here and there. The Anti-Defamation League is full of such reports. But by and large, we're pretty safe here in Canada and in the United States. On the other hand, Jews were pretty safe in and welcomed in Germany in, 1905. 1910, 1915, Jews were happy there and accepted and part of the culture. So I would say that if things go bad, and who knows, given our history, we would be welcome. We Jews in Canada and the United States and in France and England and elsewhere, we would be welcomed in Israel. So Israel is an insurance policy for us. It's nice to have a bolt hole, nice to have a place where we could go if things became bad. I remember in 1942, 1941, somewhere in there, not the Prime Minister of Canada, but the one of the people in charge of Canadian immigration was asked, how many Jews would you allow into Canada? And he said, none would be too many. So Israel will allow us if things get too hot for us, as they have in many different countries. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Zionism and anti-Semitism. Not every anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite. There are many counterexamples. For example, the Mises Institute, with which I've been associated and still am in many ways, I'm just not the senior fellow there anymore because of my views on Israel. But it's not an anti-Semitic group. It's an anti-Zionist group, yes. But who is the Mises Institute named after? Mises, who was Jewish. If a more accurate name, a friendly amendment, was offered for the Mises Institute, it would be the Mises Rothbard Institute, because Rothbard is a very strong animating force for the Mises Institute. Well, Rothbard was Jewish. I'm Jewish. I was associated with them for decades. And so I don't see even a scintilla of anti-Semitism in the Mises Institute, and I don't see it in every Zionist, anti-Zionist group. However, the UN has been subjected to complaints about Israel twice as much as all other countries put together. Let me say that again. The complaints about Israel are, say, 100. The complaints about every other country in the world all put together is 200. Sorry, I got it backwards. The Israeli complaints is 200. The complaints about every other country is only 100. This is suspicious about anti-Semitism. You have to wonder. And then, you know, the Harvard student bodies, 34 or 33 of the Harvard student, this was October 8th, one day after October 7th. And they all said it was Israel's fault. Well, I don't say that they're anti-Semitic. I know they're anti-Zionist, but I have my suspicions. So you have to be careful about that. We don't want to say that every anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite, but some of them sure as hell are.
Yeah, just to add one thing, the more, I mean, you could be, let's say, anti-Zionism as a political philosophical perspective was one thing before the establishment of the State of Israel, and it's one different thing now that the State of Israel exists. Because to oppose the State of Israel would mean that you support the State of Israel disappearing, which would entail October the 7th for the entire Jewish population of Israel and the Arab population of Israel as well. So we're talking about the killing and genocide of 10 million people. So that is what anti-Zionism would mean today. Now, in that sense, the modern form of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. But that doesn't mean that any criticism against particular Israeli policies would be anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist, because anti-Zionism is being against the State of Israel as such, not on how it is or how it conducts its policies, but to be against its existence. And now, if you are not against, or you are not, working towards the disappearance, let's say, of the state of Monaco, that would entail basically no problem for its citizens today. If the state of Monaco disappears, I mean, no one's going to try to kill them. But if the state of Israel disappears, millions of people are going to get slaughtered. So there is a huge difference here on that. So again, anti-Zionism does not necessarily entail anti-Semitism, but the modern form of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic.
Let me just give one more example. When Israel was formed, or rather right before Israel was formed, and I think what Alan said was very important. You have to distinguish before 1948 and after 1948. But before 1948, the Hasidic Jews were all against the creation of Israel. Why? Because in their Talmudic understanding, Israel should not come into being until the Messiah comes. And the Messiah hasn't come in 1948. So they were against Israel. But it would be very silly to think that the Hasidic Jews are anti-Semitic. They were not anti-Semitic. They were just anti-Zionist before 48. Now, I think Alan is absolutely correct that if anyone says that the state of Israel should disappear, that pretty much means that all the Jews get slaughtered, and that would be anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I mean, even in that respect, you have today a specific group of Jews called Neturei Karta, which basically are a few hundred people. There are like 16 million Jews in the world, something like that. Well, these are a specific Jewish ultra-Orthodox sect that's comprised of, let's say, a few hundred, 1,000 people, something like that. And they are terribly anti-Zionist, to the point that they ally themselves with Hamas, with Iran, and they support the attempts of these countries to kill Jews in Israel as well. Because when they, for example, they support Hamas today, that is what that means. Or when they support Iran today, that is what that means. So you have those extreme examples. At the same time, you see they are Orthodox Jews, right? So it's confusing on that side, but there is no confusion. You have you have the concept of the self-hating Jew, and that involves even these type of people that you see them and they are supposedly very Jewish, but in the practical side of things, what they want to see happening would entail massive mass murder of Jews. So it's completely insane.
I have two words for them: oy vey.
Right.
Indeed.
That means, oh, whoa.
Okay, so finally, so what I think I should pick up on Alan's earlier quotation that he cited regarding well, the only way for the war to be solved is the war stop trying to solve it. And it has come to my attention that there should be some initiatives from the Palestinian side to make peace, so to speak, which unfortunately is not going to happen very soon. But I'd like to hear from you, from the classical point of view, what should the Palestinians do to end war, propose peace, live together harmoniously with their Israeli neighbors, etc., etc.
Let me get to this one first, Walter. Okay, so if you see the polls today, most Palestinians support Hamas, but not all of them support Hamas. About 20%, something like that, don't support Hamas. And according to previous polls, they want to be basically they want to live, they accept to live side by side with Israel. But unfortunately, that minority is politically irrelevant. They have no visible leaders. Now that's makes sense, because if any leader would support that, they would probably get killed. But I mean, they have no political influence whatsoever. So unfortunately, both or the most important groups within Palestinian society as leaders, which are the Palestinian Authority run by Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, they are basically both don't support any kind of agreement, although it is usually the case that the PA is presented as a partner for peace. But I mean, they pay wages to mass murderers. Basically, they indoctrinate their population with Jew hatred through the educational institutions and official propaganda, and so they are not real peace partners. So you ask, what would be the condition for peace to happen, to exist? The same that exists within Israel today with its Arab population, which is the idea that they abandoned their desire to get rid of the Jews and started to live side by side with the Jews, to trade, to thrive, to flourish, to build their own societies or their own individual projects. And on the state level, the same thing that happened with Egypt, with Jordan, and with the countries that signed the Abraham Accords. They all abandoned the idea that they wanted to destroy Israel, and instead they cooperate with Israel through trade, association, mutually beneficial relationships. And basically that's it. When the Palestinian Arabs from Judea and Samaria, that is the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, understand that it is better to try to build their own society rather than trying to destroy Israeli society, the peace will come then. As a part of that, the world needs to stop imposing its own solutions to the problem, because only the people that is there is going to decide how to solve it. But basically, the Palestinian Arab will to fight needs to be eradicated. That is, they need to abandon that. They need to understand that Israel is there to stay, and to reach an agreement. Now, of course, that agreement would involve concessions and whatever, but that's something to be negotiated on the table, on the premise that you abandon violence and you abandon basically the will to destroy. That's basically what I can say.
I would add to that from Golda Meir, love your children more. Love your children more than you hate the Jews. That will go a long way toward establishing peace. In 2005, there were Jews in Gaza, and the Israeli government compelled them to leave. They compensated them. They gave them an apartment in Israel. But there was a two-state solution then. In 2005, there was a Palestinian state. It wasn't called a Palestinian state, but it was a Palestinian state. And it was democratic, sort of. Hamas won the election in 2007. What Israel really wanted was for that Gaza to become the Hong Kong of the Middle East. And to that end, There was imports of steel, imports of concrete, imports of all sorts of things. Did the state of Palestine, that is Gaza, did they build hotels? No. Did they build desalination plants? No. Did they build factories? No. What they built was tunnels under their territory in order to launch murderous attacks. They built rocket launchers in hospitals and schools. They had their own country. They keep wanting to have a two-state solution. They had one. And what did they do with it? They sent bombs to Israel. I was going to say thank God for the Iron Dome, because the Iron Dome got decapacitated 98% of them. I'm very ambivalent about the Iron Dome. If there were no Iron Dome, there wouldn't be any rockets launched. Israel would have gone right in there in 2005 or 2007 and stopped that. So I'm a little ambivalent about the Iron Dome. On the one hand, it saved Jewish lives. On the other hand, it perpetuated the mishigas, the craziness that is going on now. Yes, there should be peace. Everybody should join the Abraham Accord. Thank goodness for Donald Trump, who is active in the Abraham Accords. We owe a great debt to him. We owe a debt to him for moving from what was it, Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
He must.
We owe Jews owe a great debt to Donald Trump. Donald Trump would not have cut back on armaments that were promised Israel in the middle of a war. One of my articles in the Wall Street Journal was libertarians should vote for Donald Trump everywhere, only in the purple states, only in the states where the election will be close, because in the blue states like California and Massachusetts, Donald doesn't really need our votes because he's going to lose big. And in the red states like Texas and Florida, he doesn't really need his votes because he's going to win big. So vote for the Libertarian Party. But in those purple states, the swing states, where the Libertarian vote can help him, they should vote for him and not for the Libertarian Party. So my hope for peace in the Middle East is that Donald Trump wins the election and not Joe Biden.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Walter Block and Alan Futerman, for joining the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It was a pleasure.